I pulled into my daughter's house, warm and carrying a homemade apple cake, while my wife smiled and whispered, "She finally has the home she always dreamed of." My son-in-law welcomed us like the perfect husband, laughing with guests and accepting their compliments. Then my daughter accidentally spilled a glass of water on his shirt. His face twisted with rage, and before anyone could react, he slapped her hard across the face. His mother slowly applauded and said, "That's how a wife learns respect." My daughter grabbed my arm and whispered, "Dad, please don't make this worse. I'm so grateful you're here." The drive to Derek and Nora's new place took 40 minutes from our house in Concord. I remember the sky that evening. October in Tennessee does something to the light. Turns it amber and slow, the kind of sunset that makes everything look more beautiful than it actually is. Diane sat in the passenger seat with her dish of homemade apple cake balanced on her lap, talking about how she hoped Nora had remembered to pick up extra paper plates, because the ones from her old apartment were too flimsy for a real party. I wasn't really listening. I was thinking about the check, $43 $1,000, written out in my handwriting, signed with my name, handed to Derek Colton in a white envelope at the closing table 6 weeks earlier. 15 years of setting aside whatever I could from my engineer's salary. 20 here, 50 there, sometimes 100, when a project paid out better than expected. Welcome back to Grandpa's Revenge, where we sit with the stories that stay with you long after they're told. If this is your first time here, pull up a chair and make yourself at home. And if these stories speak to you, come along for more. I'd love to know, have you ever looked at someone close to you and felt deep down that something wasn't right, even when you couldn't explain it? Drop your answer in the comments. Now, before we go further, some details in this story have been shaped for the telling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is coincidental. It's the truth underneath the story that matters. Diane had known about the savings. Nora never did. That was deliberate. I didn't want it hanging over her like a debt. At the closing, when Derek pumped my hand and said, "Walt, I don't know what to say," I told him words weren't necessary. And I meant it. All I'd ever wanted was for my daughter to have solid ground under her feet. The street itself surprised me better than I'd pictured. Sidewalks swept clean, old oaks canopying the road, the sort of block where flags hang from porch railings and neighbors still bother to nod at each other across their lawns. The house was 2 stories, colonial-style brick face, white shutters, and a front porch wide enough for the pair of rocking chairs sitting there with their store tags still dangling. "Oh, Walt." Diane's voice dropped to almost nothing when it came into view. Her eyes went glassy the instant it hit her. That was always how she was, something beautiful or something heartbreaking. Same reaction either way. Diane's tears didn't sort between the two. "It's beautiful." "It's a good house," I said. That was the best I could do. We never made it to the door. Nora didn't come to meet us. She detonated out of the entryway. No other way to describe it. She wasn't walking, she wasn't stepping. She came through that door at full speed, clearing the porch steps in one bound and throwing her arms around my neck with enough force to push me back on my heels. That rosemary shampoo she'd used since high school, I caught it immediately. And there was that laugh, big and uncontained, the same one she'd inherited straight from Diane and refused to acknowledge. "Dad, oh my God, you're late. I've been watching the driveway for like 20 minutes. Mom, your apple cake. Yes, perfect. Come in, come in." Derek just fired up the grill. "Everyone's out back." She snatched up Diane's hand and mine together and towed us toward the front door like we were kids. She was dragging through a fairground. That was Nora all over. Whatever room she entered, she owned it. She always had. The inside of the house hummed with people. Derek's crew from the construction firm. Couples from the wedding I half recognized. A few neighbors who'd clearly already made themselves known. Everything looked fresh. New furniture, walls painted a soft, warm gray, candles clustered along the kitchen island. Music moved through the rooms. A playlist drifted between classic rock and acoustic, pitched just right, loud enough to give the evening some life, quiet enough that you could still hold a conversation. Pamela Colton was positioned by the fireplace when we came through. She moved toward us and captured Diane's hand in both of hers, that double-grip clasp that always reminded me of campaign stops and condolence lines. "So wonderful to have you here. This house wouldn't exist without your generosity. We're just glad they found a place they love," Diane answered, easy and warm, the way she always managed to be. Pamela smiled back, but behind it, her gaze tracked slowly over Diane, crown to shoes, then back, the practiced measuring look, cataloging what they see. I caught it, tucked it away, kept my face neutral. The evening found its rhythm after that. Plates filled, glasses made the rounds, laughter broke out over stories I only caught pieces of. Derek held court in the backyard with the ease of a man who'd been doing this his whole adult life. He had the gift of handshake timed, just so a laugh that landed exactly when it needed to, that uncanny ability to pull up your name and your job and how you fit into his orbit and use all three within half a minute of saying hello. People were his element. I had understood that from early on. Nora wove through the crowd with appetizers still running hostess laps, color high in her cheeks, excitement, and probably a second glass of wine. She found my eyes from the other side of the room and flashed that lopsided wide grin, the one that collapsed her face back to age 7. Something shifted in my chest, pride, or close enough to it. It didn't last long. Nora backed through the rear door with a large serving dish, roasted vegetables. I thought the kind of load that takes both hands and all your attention. She was talking over her shoulder to someone behind her, and not watching her own feet, and the edge of the patio mat caught her. She stayed upright. The dish didn't. It lurched to one side and sent the glass of ice water perched at the corner of the outdoor table straight down the front of Derek's shirt. Around us the noise didn't die, but it hitched that brief collective pause when a room senses something and holds its breath to find out how bad. Nora wheeled around apology already written across her face. "Derek, I'm so sorry I didn't let me get a towel." Derek dropped his gaze to his shirt, then raised it to Nora. Nothing shifted in his expression. That detail has stayed with me clearer than anything else from that night. Not a flash of temper, not a wince of embarrassment, not so much as a flicker of annoyance. Something else entirely, a cold quiet that moved across his face the way a blind drops over a window. He lifted his hand and pressed it to Nora's cheek. Then he hit her. Not hard enough to send her stumbling. Hard enough for the crack to reach every corner of that yard. Hard enough that her head swung with the force of it. Every conversation cut off at once. To my left, Pamela Colton raised her hands and brought them together 3 times slow. Even claps the kind you'd offer a performer who just met expectations. "That's how you keep a house in order," she said, tone pleasant as a dinner guest, and reached for her wine. I stood up. There was no conscious choice in it. My legs moved the way a hand jerks back from a hot burner, the body acting before the mind weighs in. Diane's fingers closed around my forearm, stronger than you'd think for a 61-year-old who'd spent 30 years managing second graders. She didn't speak. She held. Across from us, Nora stood with her palm flat against her cheek. Her gaze dropped to the flagstones at her feet. Nora. It came out of me lower than I wanted, rougher. She looked up. Her eyes had gone wet, but nothing had spilled over yet. She was keeping it inside by sheer force of habit, the kind that only comes from practice. "Dad, it's fine." Level voice. Too level, "We're fine." It was an accident. Just a little argument. Please. That last word drove itself into my chest like something blunt. I sat back down. I pressed my hand against my knee beneath the table, concentrated on that pressure, used it as an anchor. Around the yard, talk resumed in low, careful fragments. Eyes on plates, on glasses, on anything that wasn't Derek or Nora or us. Pamela topped off her wine. The 40-minute drive home felt considerably longer. Diane kept the empty apple cake dish in her lap. Every crumb gone, the kind of thing that would normally have pleased her. No end and said nothing, watching the dark road unspool past her window. I took a longer route than I needed to. Force of habit. What I do when my head won't settle. At the Harding and Morrow intersection, the same 4-way stop we'd rolled through for 22 years, Diane pulled her gaze from the window. "Walt." Just that. 1 word, 2 syllables. Same as she'd spoken it 10,000 times over 40 years together. But she loaded it differently that night. It took up space in the car like a passenger. My grip tightened on the wheel. I knew what was behind it, because the same thing was running on a loop in my own head, and I had no idea yet what to do about any of it. My coffee had gone stone cold while I sat at the kitchen table staring at the middle distance. 3 days out from the housewarming, and the house felt hollowed out. Diane was still in bed. Later mornings than normal, which meant poor sleep, which meant she was lying there watching the clock tick toward the alarm rather than getting up, which was the thing Diane did when something had burrowed into her that she hadn't yet put language to. I'd been up since 5, made coffee, watched the backyard shift from black to gray to that pale copper gold early October, lays over Tennessee mornings. A half-finished winterizing list for the garden sat on the table where I'd left it. I hadn't picked up the pen. 72 hours and the same 40 seconds kept cycling through the dish, going the water hitting Derek's shirt, that cold blankness settling over his face, the sound Pamela's hands meeting in applause. I kept angling for a frame I could live with. A man caught off guard by stress. A single moment that read worse from the outside than it really was. I constructed those explanations the way I used to build rough site plans at 2 in the morning before a big deadline, trying configuration after configuration, hunting for the one that held together without requiring me to knock down what I'd already put up. Diane appeared at 7:15, hair loose, the old navy cardigan she'd had since before Nora was born, pulled around her shoulders. She poured a coffee, took the chair across from mine, and didn't bother with a good morning. "I want to call her," she said. "I know, Walt. Just give her a few more days. Ring her now and she won't talk to us. She'll spend the whole call keeping us calm." Diane cupped the mug in both hands and gazed down into it, searching. She brought her palm to her cheek the way a person does when that gesture has become second nature. Those words hit somewhere low in my chest. "Diane, I'm not accusing anyone. I'm only describing what my own eyes saw." Neither of us spoke for a stretch. A cardinal settled on the bird feeder I'd put together from a kit Nora gave me for Father's Day back when she was 12. The thing had outlasted my expectations for a gift built by a 12-year-old. At 9:47, the phone lit up. Nora's name across the screen. Diane reached for it instinctively, then caught herself and looked my way. I answered. "Hey, sweetheart, Dad." She sounded cheerful, effortless, like walking into a room where everything was already in order. "I'm so sorry it took me this long to call. Things have been completely overwhelming. Derek had 3 site visits just yesterday, and getting the kitchen into any kind of working shape has been its own battle. Nora," I said, keeping my tone steady. "How are you doing?" "Good. Really good, actually. The reason I called Derek has been feeling awful about what happened at the party. A beat of silence measured and deliberate. He'd had a contractor situation eating him alive all week, and it wasn't right, and he knows it. He asked me to tell you both he's sorry you had to witness that." What I noticed, she said Derek was sorry you had to witness it. Not that Derek was sorry for what he'd done. "Are you okay?" I said. "Dad, yes, I promise. We hashed it all out afterward. The night got away from everybody. It happens." A small silence then, something that passed for a laugh, rehearsed and weightless. "You know how I am? I'm no picnic to live with myself." A pressure built behind my eyes. "Nora." My grip on the phone tightened. "Are you safe?" 2 full seconds of nothing. Then, "Dad, come on. You're being dramatic. I'm fine. Derek would never actually hurt me. That's not the situation here." Every word she chose landed with precision, like feet testing ice before trusting it. "Please don't turn this into something it's not. I really need you guys to trust us." "We trust you," I told her, because that was the one honest thing left to say. When I set the phone down, Diane was watching me from the other side of the table. I repeated it that he'd never actually hurt her. Diane's jaw went tight. She pushed back her chair, crossed to the sink, and ran water over a dish that didn't need washing. "People who haven't been hurt," she said very quietly, "don't reach for the word, actually." I had nothing to say to that. That afternoon, I phoned Boyd Fielding. The 2 of us went back to 1997 to the Riverfront Municipal Project, when Boyd was still working contract law before criminal defense claimed him. I'm not sure I could have explained why him and not somebody else. Maybe it was that Boyd never jumped in before you'd finished. I laid out the whole thing, the water glass, the slap Pamela's applause, the sound of Nora's voice on the phone that morning. Boyd held his silence for a good while after I stopped talking. "Is any of this documented?" he asked. "Photographs, recordings, something written down?" "No." "Has Nora said anything to anyone outside the family? A physician, a friend, anybody with standing?" "Not as far as I know." "Walt." Boyd's voice dropped into a register. I recognized the one he used when the news wasn't going to land well. Without hard evidence, there's almost nothing that can be done. "What you saw, it's awful. I don't doubt you for a second. I'm genuinely sorry. But one incident at a private gathering, witnesses who may not back you up, and a daughter who's telling everyone it never happened." "I know, Boyd," I said. "Keep your eyes open," he told me. "Capture whatever you can, and if Nora says one word to you, anything at all, get it on paper the moment you hang up. Daytime, word for word." I thanked him and put the phone down. Diane had moved to the living room while I was in the office. 3 photo albums were spread across the coffee table, the large ones she stored on the bottom shelf, reaching back to the year Nora was born. She sat hunched forward, elbows to knees, fixed on a picture of Nora, somewhere around 9 or 10, caught mid-laugh at something out of frame, gap-toothed and sunburned and utterly completely herself. "That girl never backed away from a fight," Diane said, still not looking up. "You remember the letter she sent to the school board? The gym water fountains? She was 13 years old. Had me read it over 4 times. I do remember. She'd stand at the kitchen counter and deliver the whole thing out loud, rehearsing. Kept going until she could get through every sentence without her voice threatening to break." I lowered myself onto the cushion beside Diane and studied that photograph. The girl, looking back at me, stood with her weight settled into the earth, like she was planted there, like nothing could move her. The young woman on the phone that morning had used the word please. I looked away from the albums before Diane could read what was happening on my face. After Diane went to bed that night, I stayed in my armchair and let my mind travel back to the wedding. 14 months back, a Saturday in August, a venue on the outskirts of Franklin paper lanterns and a live band playing too loud. I danced with Nora to a song of her choosing that I pretended to dislike and loved on the spot. At the end of the evening, I'd shaken Derek's hand. He raised the white envelope and said, "Walt, seriously, I don't have words." And I had studied his face right then, not a glance, a real look, and something behind his expression hadn't sat right. Something moving beneath the gratitude that didn't belong there. Not warmth, math, the look of someone tallying a figure. I let it go. Chalked it up to the weight of the occasion, to my nerves, to 2 glasses of champagne and a man who'd never been a champagne drinker. Sitting in that chair at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, I was done letting it go. The Thursday that followed, I positioned myself near the phone, starting at 7:30. Nora had dialed every Thursday around 8:00 since her first semester, away at school, not by agreement, just by accumulation. 10 minutes, 15, whatever happened to be on her mind. For more than a decade, it had been the most dependable part of my week. 8 o'clock arrived and slipped past. 8:15, 8:30. At 9, I switched off the television and went upstairs. 2 weeks disappeared. Then November arrived, and one Wednesday morning, I was crouched over the garden beds out back, winterizing the soil dirt under my fingernails. Knees complaining when the phone buzzed in my pocket. Nora's name on the screen. I stripped off one glove and picked up. She didn't ask about me. She said nothing about the missing Thursday calls. What she asked was whether I could help with something. Derek had a cash flow problem on a project short term, she said. They'd make it right. She felt terrible asking, but I stood out there in the cold, with soil worked into my hands, and listened to my daughter's voice, and concentrated on whether it was still the voice I knew. January arrived like a fist that year, the sort of cold that finds the weak spots in an old house and settles in permanently. Pipes straining through the night frost, forming on the inside of the garage windows. The garden beds were ash-colored and rigid under a sky that had withheld real sunlight for 2 weeks running. I was in the backyard shoring up a stretch of fence that had been tilting since the November rains, fingers raw with cold, when I caught the sound of a car turning into the drive. I'd have known Nora's car anywhere. That second-hand Corolla since she was 23, its engine rattling on the downshift, the same way it always had a noise I'd pointed out 3 separate times, and she'd cheerfully disregarded every one of them. I set the hammer down and came around the front of the house. She was moving up the front walk with her shoulders raised against the cold, a coat on I'd never seen before, dark close cut, not the sort of thing she would have chosen back when I knew her wardrobe. She caught my eye when she heard the crunch of my boots and smiled. "Hey, Dad." "Hey, yourself." I held her. She was lighter than I remembered. Why no warning call? I was nearby, and there was something I needed to talk to you both about. Diane had already heard the car. Diane answered, holding a dish towel, and her face broke wide open the moment she laid eyes on Nora, and something in my chest went tight at the sight of it. 3 months since the housewarming, Diane cooked because cooking was the only language she trusted when words felt inadequate. Pot pie and dinner, rolls the sweet potato casserole Nora had been requesting since she was small enough to sit at that table with her feet dangling. Nora talked through the whole meal the block they lived on, a restaurant Derek had gotten fond of, some backyard renovation they'd been kicking around. She talked the way a river runs, and I noticed that Derek's name came up the way weather comes up. You don't choose to mention it. It's just always there, woven into everything. The ask arrived after the plates were cleared. Turns out the plumbing is worse than what the inspector caught. She said, both hands wrapped around her mug like she needed the warmth. Whole stretch of pipe under the slab has to come out. Derek pulled 3 quotes, and every single one of them hurts. She named a figure. It was a serious amount. I didn't let it show. Of course, I said. We'll move it over Monday. Something released in Nora's shoulders, maybe half an inch, maybe less. But I saw it. Thank you, Dad. I hate having to come to you like this. You're not coming to us for yourself, Diane said, no softness in it. You're coming for your home. That's not the same thing. Nora was out the door an hour later. Derek was expecting her. Quick hugs on the porch, a promise to call, and she was already down the walk before we'd thought to ask her to linger. Hindsight makes certain things obvious. In those months leading up to the switch, Derek had been working quietly to trim away everyone in Nora's life. Former coworkers started getting silence. College friends got short replies that eventually became nothing. By the time Lacey came into the picture, barely anyone remained who saw Nora often enough to sense that something was off. 2 weeks went by. Then she showed up again. Something about her was different, and I couldn't pin it. I stood there in the doorway, running through the possibilities, and kept coming up empty. Not the hair, not the makeup, not her posture or her walk. It was something deeper than that. The geometry of her face, the set of her jaw, the slope of her nose. Minor things, the kind you chalk up to bad lighting on any other person. But I had been reading that face for 28 years. At lunch, Diane reached over and very lightly turned Nora's chin toward the window. "Sweetheart," she said, "did something change your face?" I had a little work done. Nora eased back with a smile that came just a beat behind where it should have been. Contouring some filler, a touch of refinement on the bridge. "It's not a big deal, Mom. Most of the women in Derek's circle have done something similar." "Why didn't you say anything?" Diane pressed. "Because it's my face." There was an edge in Nora's voice that almost felt like the real her, almost that familiar spark. "I get to make choices about my own appearance without running it past the family first." Diane backed off, but her gaze kept returning to Nora's profile all through the rest of the meal, moving in quiet, deliberate little shifts. Like the way you stare at a word in another language that you almost know. The second visit was about an investment. Derek had spotted an opportunity: commercial development, strong projected returns. A circle of partners he vouched for, a narrow window to get in early. Nora presented it cleanly, smoothly, the way someone recites a thing they've rehearsed. I put 2 or 3 questions to her. Every answer came back just a shade too tidy, too fully formed. I wrote the check anyway. Then, early February, a third knock at the door. Diane was out at her book club. Just me. Nora came in, pulled off her scarf, dropped into a chair at the kitchen table. We made small talk for a minute or two. Then she told me Derek had his eye on something else. Private equity, very exclusive, time-sensitive. "What exactly is the money going toward?" I asked. She paused. "I already told you private equity. Dad, it's real estate adjacent. Derek's been tracking this group for—" "I heard you," I said. My voice stayed flat, my hands resting still on the table. "I need to know what the funds are actually used for. Who receives them? Who's running the structure? What are the terms?" A flicker crossed her face there and gone before I could name it. A tightening at the corners of her eyes, the way a window slams shut in a draft. Then the open, easy smile slid back into place. "Derek's not comfortable with me sharing the specifics," she said, keeping it breezy. "His partners are particular about confidentiality. But, Dad, we wouldn't be asking if this wasn't a sure thing." I looked at her steadily. She held my gaze, her daughter's eyes, her daughter's smile, and beneath both of those, something that belonged to neither. "I need a few days," I told her. She walked out 20 minutes later, empty-handed. Diane came home to find me sitting at the table, coffee gone cold in front of me. "She was here," I said. Diane didn't phrase it as a question. 3 times this month. She set her bag down and studied my face. What did she need? I laid it out for her. Diane stood listening, arms folded across her chest, jaw locked. "Walt," she said, then stopped herself. "What is it? This morning when she walked in, did you notice her at the coffee pot?" I replayed it. Nora had gone straight to the counter, taken down a mug poured from the pot, without so much as a pause. Stood there and drank half of it before she even sat down. "She does that every time," I said. Diane shook her head. "Walt, Nora hasn't been able to tolerate coffee since she was 16. Her pulse would go haywire. She nearly passed out at prom. The doctor told her years ago to quit it entirely." She pressed her mouth into a thin line. 12 years without a single cup. I've personally seen her wave it off more times than I can count. I held my wife's gaze. Diane's voice didn't waver once as she said it. That girl stood in this kitchen this morning and drank a full mug of black coffee like it was nothing. March edged in, and the cold finally started to let go. Diane and I had not once sat down and said plainly what we were both thinking. We'd been moving around it for weeks, getting close, and then stepping away the way you circle something dangerous that you're not quite prepared to confront. Then Derek phoned. He wanted us to come for dinner. His suggestion he made clear. Nothing elaborate, just cook something, sit together, clear the air a little. He said he hated that there was distance between us. His tone on the call was easy, a little self-effacing tuned precisely to land that way. I set the phone down and stood there in the hallway, turning it over. Derek wants us to come to dinner, I said to Diane. She took a moment. Are we going? Yes, I said. We'll go. We'll sit at that table, eat whatever's put in front of us, and I'll be watching everything that moves in that house. Diane held my eyes for a beat longer than usual. All right, Walt, she said. All right. Something had shifted when we pulled up to the house. All that coiled tension from the house, warming it had been stripped out and replaced with its perfect imitation. Music drifting from the speakers, soft and recognizable. Candles lit on the table. Derek in the kitchen, wearing a stiff, just unwrapped apron, tending to something that smelled like it had been cooking for hours. He came across the room, the moment he saw us, gripped my hand in both of his, and pulled Diane into a hug like they'd known each other for decades. Really glad you made it. Nora's upstairs finishing up. Pamela's joining us too, if that's all right. Pamela got there 10 minutes after us, red wine tucked under her arm, which she passed to Diane with a smile the kind that stops well short of the eyes. You look wonderful, she said. Nora appeared on the stairs in a burgundy dress I didn't recognize. She moved to Diane, first pulled her close. Mom, I'm so glad you came. The words landed correctly. The feeling in them landed correctly. And Diane held on, and I watched Diane's face from across that hug, watched it stay just a degree too measured, too composed. Dinner itself was fine. Derek had put together beef stew cornbread, a salad with those little croutons Diane liked. Pamela kept the wine going. Talk stayed in safe, easy territory. What was happening on the street, a project Derek had in mind, some documentary Pamela had caught recently. Nora sat directly across from me. She laughed when laughing was called for. She asked Diane questions about book club. She topped off water glasses before anyone thought to ask. Every gesture correct. Every beat hitting on cue. I noticed how she covered her mouth mid-laugh. Right hand. I dropped my eyes to my plate. I told myself I had it wrong. Nora always, but did she? Right hand, left hand. I genuinely didn't know anymore. And not knowing that was exactly where Derek and Pamela needed me to be. The frittata came out with the second course. Derek had made it as a side sliced into wedges. Nora took a piece, worked her fork through it, and finished every bite, including the dense yellow center, unhurried, wearing the face of someone who had always eaten eggs exactly that way. I felt Diane go rigid beside me. I set my fork down, lifted my wine glass, drew a long breath in through my nose. After dessert, I excused myself, said I needed some air. I slipped out the back door onto the patio and stood in the cool March dark with my hands in my pockets taking stock of the yard. Security light on the garage, bare flower beds, a covered gas grill, and at the far end, tight against the fence line, a storage shed with a padlock on it. The wood around the doorframe looked newer than the rest of the structure, recently reinforced, not yet weathered to match. I noticed it, the way you notice things after 40 years of studying how buildings are assembled. I stood there a moment. Then Derek's voice came through the screen door, asking whether I wanted coffee, and I went back inside. We said our goodbyes out on the front porch. Pamela kissed Diane's cheek. Derek shook my hand. That same two-handed grip. Nora hugged us both and said we should make this a monthly thing. Diane and I walked to the car, clear night temperature falling. I had my keys out already when we reached the end of the driveway, where it bent around a low hedge before the sidewalk. A boy stepped out from behind the hedge, 10 years old maybe. Slight build, dark hoodie, white sneakers. He didn't flinch when he saw us. If anything, he looked like he'd been out there waiting. His eyes came straight to mine, direct and serious, in a way that had no business on a face that young. "Excuse me," he said. "Are you her parents? The lady in that house?" Diane's hand found my arm. "We're her family," I said carefully. "Who are you, son?" The boy glanced back toward the house. Then he turned to me again. And what came out of his mouth next took the air clean out of my lungs. He couldn't have been older than 10. Slight frame, dark hoodie zipped to the chin, white sneakers that had seen better days. He was standing at the bend in the driveway where the hedge met the sidewalk, and he wasn't fidgeting, wasn't glancing around the way kids do when they've wandered somewhere they shouldn't be. He'd made a decision, and he was holding to it. His eyes went straight to mine. Serious eyes. Old eyes for that face. "That lady in there," he said, nodding back toward the house, "isn't your daughter. She's not the same person." The words landed like cold water thrown across you, the kind of shock the body registers a full beat before the mind does. Diane's fingers locked around my forearm so tight I could feel her knuckles. I bent down to get closer to his level. My knees complained the way they always do in cold weather, but I ignored them. "Son," I said, keeping my voice steady. "What's your name?" Webb." No hesitation. "Webb, where do you live?" He turned and pointed at the house right next door to Derek and Nora's, a smaller place, yellow siding, a wind spinner on the front porch turning in the March breeze. Then he looked back at me with those calm, level eyes. "My mom said I shouldn't get involved," he said. But I kept thinking about it. He glanced at Diane, then back to me. "You needed to know." Before I could get another word in, he turned and walked quickly back up the drive toward his house, hands tucked in his front pocket, not running exactly, but moving with the purposeful pace of a child who has said the thing he came to say and considers the matter closed. Diane and I stood on the sidewalk and watched him go. "Walt," Diane started. "He's a kid." The words came out harder than I meant them to. Kids say things. He probably caught a conversation through the wall, or he's got an imagination, or I hit the key fob and the car beeped. "Let's go home." Diane didn't push. She got in the passenger seat and stared straight ahead through the windshield while I started the engine, and we drove the 40 minutes home with the radio off and almost nothing said between us. Somewhere on I-65, Diane made a sound not quite a word, more like the first syllable of one she thought better of finishing. I kept both hands on the wheel eyes on the road and fed myself the same line again and again, the way you recheck a calculation, hoping the number comes out different. He's 10 years old. He doesn't know anything. Children misinterpret things all the time. By the time we turned into our driveway, I'd almost convinced myself. Diane went to bed at 10:00. I told her I'd be up soon. I wasn't. I settled into the armchair in the living room, lamp dark, the only light coming off the phone screen in my hand. I opened my photos and found the wedding album, the digital copies the photographer had delivered. 843 images from a Saturday in August, 14th months back. I pulled up the close shots of Nora's face, the ones where she was laughing, the ones where she'd gone quiet and serious, the one where she was dancing and had no idea the camera was pointed at her. I sat there in the dark and looked at them for a long time. Then I thought about the woman who had sat across the dinner table from me tonight. The way she laughed, the way she held her wine glass, the line of her jaw in the candlelight. I pressed my thumb and forefinger hard against the bridge of my nose until it hurt. I couldn't say they were different. I couldn't say they were the same. And the fact that I couldn't be certain after 28 years of fatherhood, after knowing that face since it was red and scrunched and brand new in a hospital room, that was the thing making my chest feel like it was being pressed in from both sides. I put the phone down and stared at the ceiling. The Thursday calls. The thought came without warning, and I sat up straighter. Every Thursday at 8:00 without fail, since Nora left for college at 18, 10 years of Thursday evenings. Rain or shine, finals week or vacation. It didn't matter. She called. We talked about nothing that mattered much. I pretended not to need it, and I needed it enormously, and she understood that, and never once said so. I started counting backward. The wedding was August 2021. That was, I worked through the math, slowly, carefully. 31 Thursdays ago. 31 Thursday evenings at 8:00. My phone had not rung a single one of them. I had told myself she was still settling in. Told myself marriage reshapes a person's rhythms, that I wasn't owed a call on a fixed schedule. I had constructed that reasoning with care, and I had lived inside it for 7 months without ever pressing on the seams. Sitting in the dark at 11:40 on a Tuesday night, I laid my hand flat against my chest and felt my own pulse and understood that the seams had never been sound. I had just been too afraid to test them. The following Monday morning, a car pulled into the driveway. I was in the kitchen when Diane opened the front door. I heard their voices, Diane's warm and even the other one bright and polished. I stayed where I was. A few minutes later, I heard Diane ask something, her tone easy and conversational, the particular ease she uses when she isn't easy at all. Then I heard the answer. Then the front door closed. Diane appeared in the kitchen doorway. Her face had taken on that specific color it goes when she's holding something large, Not pale, exactly. More like the blood had pulled inward, retreating somewhere deeper. Mittens, Diane said. I set my coffee mug down. What? I asked about the cat, she said. The one Nora had in 6th grade. Diane's voice was entirely flat. I asked what she named it. I already knew. I knew it before Diane said a word. Knew it the way you know the end of something you've been bracing yourself for. Biscuit, I said quietly. She named it Biscuit. Diane gave one slow nod. She said Mittens, confident, no hesitation at all. The house felt altered after the door closed, smaller somehow, as if the walls had pressed inward a couple of inches while I wasn't paying attention. Diane stood in the hallway with her back to me, one hand still resting on the door handle, shoulders drawn up and tight in a way I hadn't seen since the year her mother was ill. I came around the kitchen island and moved close enough that she'd know I was there. Diane turned around. Her eyes were rimmed red but dry. Diane cried freely over good things, and almost never over the hard ones. The cat's name was Biscuit, she said, her voice giving out on that last syllable. Nora had named it herself. She walked through the door carrying that animal in a shoebox and declared to everyone in earshot that his name was Biscuit, because that's exactly what color he was. She was 11 years old, Walt. I was there. I know. My throat felt like something was caught in it. That woman said Mittens without even flinching. Diane pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for a moment. Then she straightened, drew her cardigan tight around herself, and moved past me into the living room. Get the albums. We laid all 3 of them out across the coffee table, the large ones with the plastic sleeves and handwritten dates along the spines. Diane had kept them with care, one photograph to a sleeve, captions in blue ink on the back of each. We worked through them the way you'd work an excavation, methodically, deliberately, without hurrying. Diane held up a photo of Nora at maybe 17, laughing at something beyond the frame. Look at the jawline right here, she said, where it comes up to the ear. I looked. Then I thought about the woman at our dinner table the night before, candlelight falling across her face. I went to the kitchen drawer, where I kept the household files, and pulled out the delivery receipt from February, the grocery order that had come to the house while we were visiting, the one she'd signed for. Her signature was there, in the lower right corner, round upright letters tilting slightly to the right. I went to the filing cabinet in my office and found the wedding folder, the venue contract, the photographer's invoice, a copy of the marriage license, and there Nora's signature on the catering agreement we'd helped them arrange. Small, compressed, every letter leaning hard to the left. I carried both papers back to the living room and placed them side by side on the coffee table. Diane looked at them. She pressed her lips together so hard the color drained out of them. Then she rose abruptly and crossed to the window, stood there with her arms folded, staring out at the street, her back to me, to the papers, and to everything they were saying. "I'm calling Boyd," I said. Boyd picked up on the second ring. I walked him through all of it. The coffee, the cat's name, the signatures, the unease that had been sitting in my stomach since a 10-year-old boy told me the woman living in my daughter's house wasn't my daughter. I told him about the face that was nearly right but not quite, about the Thursday calls that had stopped the week after the wedding. Boyd stayed quiet longer than usual after I finished. "Walt," he said carefully, "you're telling me you think someone replaced your daughter? I'm telling you I need to find out," I said. "I'm not making accusations. I'm telling you what I have and asking what to do with it." Another pause. I could hear him turning it over on the other end of the line. Boyd always went still when he was being careful. "The signatures are your strongest physical evidence right now. Everything else is behavioral, harder to build on in any formal way." He let out a slow breath. "I know someone. Retired cop, been doing private work for about 8 years. Solid, discreet, knows how to gather things that will hold up. His name is Clyde Maddox. Let me reach out to him today." After I hung up, I stood in the hallway a moment with the phone held against my chest. Then I walked down to Nora's room. Diane hadn't touched a thing since the day Nora moved out. We'd talked about turning it into a guest room and never followed through. I understood now that Diane had known the way mothers know things, that she wasn't ready. The poster on the wall was one Nora had picked up at a street fair when she was 16, a print of a painting she'd loved for reasons she could never quite put into words. The colored pencils were still in their tin on the desk. The quilt on the bed was the one Diane's mother had made. I sat down on the edge of the mattress. On the shelf above the desk, tucked between a stack of old sketchbooks and a ceramic mug bristling with dried-out pens, sat a small wooden box I'd built myself. Cherrywood plain joinery, a brass latch on the front. I'd made it in the garage when Nora was 4, and I'd been adding something to it every year since. I lifted it down, set it on my knees, and opened the latch. 28 cards, one for every birthday, each one drawn by hand with whatever pencils or markers I had around. I was no artist and had never claimed to be, but Nora had loved them anyway, or said she did. After a while, I stopped wondering whether she meant it, and just kept making them because they were the one thing I could give her that no one else on earth could. The first one, a lopsided orange cat whiskers uneven crayon on construction paper. The fifth, a bicycle, because that was the year she learned to ride one. The 16th, a guitar, because she'd asked for lessons and practiced for exactly 3 weeks before moving on to something else, and I had loved her for both the asking and the quitting. The 28th, 2 hands drawn more carefully than any of the others reaching toward each other from opposite edges of the card. I'd slipped it into the pocket of her dress bag the morning of the wedding, and she'd called me from the bridal suite 40 minutes later with her voice coming apart. And I'd had to clear my throat 3 times before I could speak. I sat there on her bed with the box open on my knees and looked at 28 years of Thursdays and birthdays and ordinary Tuesday evenings, and my eyes burned so badly I had to shut them. The next morning I met Clyde Maddox at a diner off Gallatin Pike. He was already in the booth when I got there, mid-50s, gray at the temples, a face that had absorbed enough of the world that nothing landed on it hard anymore. He had a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking and a yellow legal pad he hadn't written on yet. I laid the 2 signature samples on the table between us. He studied them without picking them up. Then he looked at me. "Before Derek Colton married your daughter," he said, "did he have a girlfriend?" The question dropped into the room like a stone into still water. I felt the ripples move out through everything I thought I'd understood. "Not that I know of," I said. Why? Clyde looked at the signatures again, then back at me. His expression held, but something behind his eyes sharpened in a way that sent a chill across the back of my neck. Because he said slowly, "I think I know what I'm looking for now." The neighborhood where Clyde kept his office was the kind that Nashville had been slowly renovating for 20 years, without ever quite finishing brick storefronts with fresh awnings beside buildings that hadn't seen paint since the 90s. A barber shop next to a craft brewery next to a tax preparation office with a hand-lettered sign in the window. Clyde's place was wedged between a dry cleaner and a locksmith. The sign on the door read, "Maddox Investigative Services," in plain black letters. Nothing decorative. I'd been sitting in my truck for 10 minutes before I went in. The office was small. A desk, 2 chairs for clients, a filing cabinet, a window looking out onto a brick wall. Clyde was already there when I walked in. A folder lay open on the desk in front of him, his yellow legal pad covered in handwriting I couldn't make out from across the room. He nodded when I entered and gestured to the chair. "I'll start with Derek," he said. No preamble. I appreciated that about him. He turned the legal pad around so I could read the top section numbers, dates, institution names. Derek Colton's financial picture is significantly worse than anything in the public record suggests. He's skilled at keeping it structured. LLC layers assets held in his mother's name, the kind of arrangement that looks legitimate until you start pulling at the threads. Clyde tapped the pad with his pen. 3 construction projects in the last 5 years, 2 failed outright. One is technically still active but hasn't turned a profit. He owes roughly $400,000 across 2 private lenders and a commercial line of credit that's been in default since 2020. The number settled into my stomach like something with weight. $400,000. I thought about the $43,000 I'd written on that check and felt suddenly brutally naive. And before Nora, I said, "You found something." Clyde opened the folder. He pulled out a photograph, a standard print, the kind you run off from a digital file, and set it on the desk facing me. "Her name is Lacey Pruitt," he said. "She and Derek were together for 4 years. Met at Vanderbilt University. Broke up approximately 8 months before Derek started seeing your daughter." I picked up the photograph. The tremor started in my fingers before my mind had caught up to what my eyes were seeing. Not a shake exactly, more like a current running up from the knuckles through the wrist, something the body does when it understands before the brain does. The woman in that photo carried Nora's cheekbones, Nora's jawline, that same faint upward pull at the outer edge of each eye. Close, but not exact. The nose sat differently. The proportions were slightly wrong, yet the foundational structure of the face, the bones underneath everything, was near enough that a stranger might look twice and ask whether these 2 women shared blood. "How did Derek track Nora down?" I asked, steadier than I felt. "Social media, in all likelihood." Your daughter's profile was public, her work what she was building her projects out in the open. He would have come across the photos easily. Clyde laid a second image on the desk next to the first. This is Lacey roughly 4 months back. I studied it. The nose had changed. The jawline was sharper now, more sculpted. The cheekbones angled differently than in the first picture. The two images still shared something, the eyes the underlying framework, but the second one had been worked on, adjusted the way a sculptor refines a rough form into something finished. The likeness to Nora wasn't approximate anymore. It had become exact. She went under the knife, I said. More than once. I turned up records from a private cosmetic clinic in Huntsville, Alabama, all cash, which is not how people typically pay for elective work at that scale. You use insurance, you use financing. Somebody wanted no document linking a procedure to a name. Clyde placed a third page on the desk between us, looked like an appointment. Log, personal details blacked out, only dates and procedure types visible. The window matches the 6 months running up to your daughter's wedding. I moved Lacey's before photo. Aside, then reached into my jacket and produced what I'd brought along, a copy of Nora's wedding portrait, printed that same morning. I set it between Lacey's two pictures. 3 images in a line. I sat with them and didn't speak. Clyde gave me the silence. A truck rolled past outside, and after that the room was still. This was mapped out well before any wedding date, I said. Wasn't a question, wasn't a charge, just the only thing that made sense of what was in front of me. Clyde gave a slow nod. Far before. The surgical schedule alone puts the planning at a minimum of 6 months ahead of the ceremony, conceivably longer, depending on when Derek first chose your daughter as his mark. That word landed on me like something cold poured down my spine. His mark, my daughter, my Nora, chosen and targeted. I flattened both hands on the desk and made myself breathe through my nose. You mentioned there was more, I said. You told me last week you needed a few extra days. I do. Clyde shut the folder. I'm not ready to put it in front of you until I'm sure. Come back Friday. I made the drive home with all 3 photographs face down on the passenger seat because glancing at them while I had my hands on the wheel wasn't something I could afford. That evening at 7:43, my phone buzzed on the table. Nora's name glowing on the screen, the contact label I'd never been able to bring myself to update. Dad. Warm, easy, pitch perfect. How are you two doing? Feels like ages since we've spoken. We're holding up, I said. And you incredible, honestly. Derek has really stepped up lately. That's actually why I'm calling. He's been wanting to get you guys back over. Maybe next Saturday he's had his eye on a new recipe he wants to try. That works, I said. Tell him we'll be there. Wonderful. I'll shoot Mom a text with everything. Love you, Dad. Love you too, I said. Click. Gone. I settled back in the armchair, phone resting in my lap. Those 3 photographs still face down on the side table, and I looked at the wall and felt something I had no name for, the specific chill that moves through a man who has just said, I love you, and known even as the words left his mouth that he was saying them to the wrong person. Diane never said exactly when the idea came to her. She must have been quietly working toward it for some time. That was her way with anything that carried real weight. She brought it up one evening, like it was nothing, the way you'd mentioned the laundry was already running. I'm going to invite her for coffee, she said. Just the 2 of us. Derek stays home. I lowered the newspaper. When already happened. Wednesday. She agreed to come. That was Diane. 3 decades standing in front of a 2nd grade classroom had wired something into her, the understanding that people reveal themselves most honestly when they believe nobody is paying close attention. She had honed that instinct on children since 1992. She was turning it now on the woman sleeping in our daughter's bed. She recounted everything when she got back, sitting at the kitchen table, both hands wrapped around her mug, the tea inside long since gone cold. They'd met at a cafe on Hillsborough Road, somewhere neither of them owned Diane's pick. Lacey had beaten her there, which Diane registered the instant she walked in, already seated, already oriented toward the door. Diane told me she'd wanted to be the one who settled in, first the one who chose the seat, who felt the room before the other person arrived. She recognized in Lacey's behavior what she'd seen in children who come to a test having already rehearsed. The coffee arrived. Diane watched Lacey lift her cup with her right hand, watched her bring her right hand to her mouth when something Diane said made her laugh. For 28 years, Diane had watched Nora do that same thing with her left hand. Had seen it so many thousands of times, it was woven into her understanding of who her daughter was. as natural and readable as punctuation. She filed that away and kept the conversation moving. I brought up the 4th of July when she was 9, Diane told me. The year the three of us drove down to Gulf Shores and she got stung by a jellyfish and sobbed for 40 minutes and then put away 2 ice cream cones and announced it was the best day of her whole life. Diane went quiet for a moment. She said she remembered it. Ran through the beach, the fireworks, the ice cream, not one detail wrong. Diane's voice went tight as she said it. But the way she told it was wrong. She recounted it from a distance like she was giving testimony. Nora's version of that story always started with, "I was so dramatic, oh my God, Mom." She'd turn it into a joke about herself, cringe at her own 9-year-old theatrics. This one delivered a summary. Diane had tucked a photo into her bag before she left the house. One, I've always loved Nora at 16, face pink from the sun, laughing wide at the camera hair wrecked from a full day at the lake. Shot it myself on a disposable grainy and slightly overexposed, and it's perfect because of that, not despite it. A moment that actually happened. Diane pushed it across the table. You remember this one? Your dad shot this the summer you turned 16. Lacey looked down at it. Her face arranged itself into something soft, something fond. Diane said it was persuasive, genuinely so. She talked about the water, the heat of that particular summer, how her hair had fought her all season long. But what she did was describe the photograph, Diane said. She reacted to the image in front of her, not to the memory behind it. Nora would have said something like, I look completely feral in this picture. She'd have snatched it up and tried to flip it over mortified. Diane looked down at her cold mug. This one held it like a keepsake. Then Diane reached across and put her hand over Lacey's. Honey, are you doing all right? She said. You seem worn out. Diane told me that a change moved through Lacey's face right then. Fast, barely there, a flutter behind the eyes the way light will shift through a curtain in a draft. Something that read like guilt or grief, or maybe just the bone-deep fatigue of someone who had been pretending for months with no end in sight. For 2 solid seconds, Diane believed she was about to hear something true. Then Lacey's phone lit up on the table. Pamela's name on the screen. Lacey drew her hand back, pushed to her feet. Apologized. Derek's mother had been trying to get hold of her. She really had to take it, and in under 90 seconds she had settled. The bill said her goodbyes and walked out. Diane stayed at that table alone for a little while. Then she got in the car and came home. She went directly to the bathroom, shut the door behind her. She told me afterward that she lowered herself onto the tile floor and sat with her back against the tub, and she stayed there until she didn't know how much time had passed. She cried, she said, in a way she hadn't cried since the night her own mother died. Not grief, not exactly, more like the wreckage of certainty. The thing that happens when you stop hoping you're wrong. When she got herself up, she ran cold water over her wrists, pressed a towel to her face, and walked to the kitchen. She picked up the phone and called me. I was sitting in the truck 2 blocks from Clyde's office. It isn't her, Walt. Her voice was stripped down, but it held. I know it isn't her. I steered to the curb, cut the engine, and took the wheel in both hands, gripping until the knuckles whitened. Diane. I held her hand, she said. Her breath snagged. I held her hand and I looked into her eyes. Walt and our Nora was gone. She wasn't there. The tightness moved out of my hands, up through my arms, and buried itself in my chest, where it sat like something with mass, something that wasn't going anywhere. Then where is she, Diane? I could barely get it above a murmur. Where is our Nora? She had no answer, neither did I. What's coming next stopped me cold the first time I understood it, because it wasn't just a suspicion anymore. Something had been hidden in plain sight for a very long time, and the weight of it was almost too much to hold. Tell me, if a quiet, nagging feeling kept whispering that something was deeply wrong, would you trust it and act, or wait until you had something you could prove? We stayed on the line together, neither of us speaking, just 2 people sitting inside, a question that had no answer, yet feeling the full and terrible weight of knowing it was real. May arrived warm and quick the way it does in Tennessee. 1 week you're still clicking the heat on after dark. The next the azaleas are spent and the air carries cut grass and something sweet you couldn't put a word to. I barely registered any of it. The same circuit had been running in my head for 3 weeks. A 10-year-old boy at the bottom of a driveway. A storage shed with a brand new padlock. A woman at a dinner table who handled her eggs wrong and laughed with the wrong hand. I kept coming back to the house the boy had pointed to. yellow siding a wind spinner on the front porch right up against Derek and Nora's property, near enough that someone sitting in that kitchen could catch every sound coming from the yard next door. I drove over on a Tuesday afternoon and said nothing to Diane about where I was headed, not to hide it. I just wasn't ready to explain a plan that hadn't fully formed. I left the truck at the curb, walked to the door and knocked. Nothing. The wind spinner turned slowly in the breeze. Through the front window I could make out a lamp burning in the living room, the restless blue glow of a television set. I knocked a second time, waited, then went back to the truck. I returned the next morning at 9:00, knocked twice, stepped back, kept my hands in my jacket pockets so I wouldn't look like a threat. The door opened 3 inches. A security chain went taut across the gap. One eye, dark and wary, studied me from the other side. "I don't want trouble." Her voice came out flat and certain. The voice of a woman who'd spoken those words before and meant them every single time. "I don't know you," she said, and the door began to shift. "Your son spoke to me," I said quickly. "A few weeks back outside the house next door. He told me something I haven't been able to set down since." The door went still. The eye behind the chain didn't move. "He doesn't know anything," she said carefully. "He knows enough," I said. "And I think you do too." The door closed. I heard the chain scrape in its track, and for one sick moment, I was certain she was bolting it. Then the deadbolt disengaged, and the door swung open. Yvette Webb was 40 years old, and wore the look of someone who worked hard and slept less than the body asks for. Scrubs. Either just in from a night shift, or about to leave for one. Her eyes were sharp and tired in equal measure, that particular combination you find in people who've learned that exhaustion doesn't excuse you from staying alert. She didn't welcome me in. She stepped back and made room, and that was all the invitation I was going to get. The boy, her son, was at the kitchen table with his homework spread in front of him. He looked up when I came through the door, recognized me at once, and shut his notebook with the measured deliberateness of a child who has decided to be present for something meant for adults. Yvette sat across from me. She didn't offer anything. She placed her hands flat on the table and held me in a direct calibrating gaze, a woman who had spent her whole life navigating hard situations in harder circumstances, and had grown precise at knowing which ones deserved her attention. "My name is Walt Grady," I said. "The woman living next door, the one everyone believes is named Nora Colton. She's my daughter." "Nora is my daughter." I stopped. "Or she was. The woman in that house right now is not her. I have evidence she was replaced, and I don't know where my real daughter is." I kept my voice level. "I came because I believe you've witnessed things, and I need to know what." Yvette was quiet. She looked at her son. He looked back, and something moved between them, the unspoken shorthand of two people who've been through enough together to read each other's signals without a word. She turned back to me and began. "The first months after the wedding," she said, "were not quiet, not party noise, but distress noise. She worked nights at the hospital, came home around 6 in the morning, and the lights next door were still burning, voices still going, shouting, crying, the specific sound of someone trying to hold it back and losing. One morning, I came home, and she was out in the backyard. Yvette's voice was low, each word placed down with care, like she was crossing ground she wasn't sure would bear her weight, sitting on the earth near the fence with both arms wrapped around her knees. Then Pamela came outside, took hold of her, and walked her back in. She paused. Pamela didn't console her. She just collected her, the way you'd retrieve something that had ended up where it didn't belong. The boy was watching his mother with the close attention of a child storing something away. "There was one night I nearly called 911, Yvette went on. "It got loud enough that I was standing right there with the number half dialed already in my hand." She nodded toward the kitchen window. "Then I thought about what happened the time before. A neighbor down the block had called in a disturbance over there once. By the time officers arrived, Derek was shaking their hands and offering sweet tea, and the whole thing dissolved. They drove away grinning." She set her jaw. "I'm a black single mother. Derek Colton has money, a contractor's license, and people who owe him." I put the phone down. She looked at me without flinching. No apology in it, just the honest weight of a decision she'd made and had been carrying ever since. "I could have called," she said. "I didn't. That's mine to live with." Those words landed somewhere deep and exact, because I knew exactly what she meant. I thought about the dinner table, the egg yolk, the song I hummed that she didn't know the words to, all the moments I'd seen something wrong and reached for the reading that let me drive home in peace. "You're doing something now," I said. "That counts for something." A change moved across Yvette's face, not relief exactly, but the easing of something that had been pressing without a break. She pressed her lips together, once nodded, then turned her eyes to her son. He sat up slightly. He'd been ready for this. I could tell from the moment I'd walked through the door that he'd known this moment was coming. His hands lay flat on the closed notebook. He met my eyes with the same settled steadiness that had caught me off guard the first time I'd seen him at the foot of that driveway in the gray of a March evening. Yvette said, "There's something else, something my son saw, about 3 weeks ago." I pressed both hands flat on the table. I looked at Marcus Webb, and I waited. He didn't look to his mother for permission. He'd already received it. That nod at the table had been the signal, and now he simply faced me and began. "It was a Saturday afternoon," he said. His voice was unhurried and clear, the voice of a child who had gone over this before, not to make it sound good, but to make sure he got it right. "I was raking up leaves in the backyard. We've got this big oak that drops things all year long. Mom wants it cleaned up on weekends." What time, I asked. "Maybe 3 or so." Sun was still out. He looked at his hands briefly, then back at me. I heard a noise coming from the shed on the other side of the fence. I figured it was a stray cat. We get them back there. They get into things. He paused. So I walked closer to the fence, and it got louder. I kept myself still. Every muscle in me wanted to close the distance. "It wasn't a cat," he said. "It was a scratching sound, like fingernails going across wood." Then he swallowed. Then I heard a voice. It was very faint, like someone who hadn't spoken in a long time, and their throat had forgotten how. He looked at me without looking away. "Help," he said. "Please, is someone there?" The words came down into that kitchen like stones dropped into still water. I felt them reach the bottom of something inside me. "I ran and got Mom," he said plainly. Yvette took it from there, her hands pressing harder against the table surface. I came out fast. He had his hand on the fence pointing. We went to the gap. There's a board near the back corner that's come loose, wide enough to see through if you get close. She pressed her lips tight. At the base of the shed door, there's a gap, an inch of light maybe. I looked through the fence and I could see that gap, and there were fingers underneath it. Fingernails against the wooden floor. She stopped. Then she looked up. My throat had sealed itself shut. I pressed one fist to the center of my chest and forced air through my nose. She looked up through the door gap, Yvette said, and I could see her face in that thin strip of light. Her voice dropped to barely a breath. And it was the same face I'd been looking at next door for months. The same face. She shook her head slowly. I grabbed the boy, and we went inside, locked the door, killed the lights, and the two of us sank down onto the kitchen floor because I had no idea what else to do. Marcus spoke again, his voice low. I knew it wasn't the same person. I'd known before that, actually. The woman who moved in, she never came out to the backyard. The one from before the real one. She used to toss a ball back over the fence whenever her dog got it stuck on our side. He looked at me. The dog's name was Peanut. Small thing, kinda tan. I used to hear her calling it. After about 3 months, I never heard Peanut again. And the new woman never set foot in the backyard. Not once. Peanut, Nora's dog. The one she'd gotten 2 years ago. The one she'd sent us holiday photos of, the one she'd named because it was the size of one. I sat looking at this 10-year-old boy who had noticed a missing dog, who had moved toward a sound instead of away from it, who had walked up to 2 strangers at the end of a driveway because he'd made up his mind they needed to know. And I had to turn away for a moment toward the window, toward the oak tree in the backyard, letting its leaves go in the May breeze because my eyes were burning so badly I couldn't see him straight. "Marcus," I said, when I could manage it, "you did the right thing." He nodded, not with pride, just the plain acknowledgement of a fact. I shook Yvette's hand at the door. She held on a beat longer than she needed to, and I understood that was a message of its own. I thanked her. She said, "Don't thank me yet." I climbed into the truck, pulled out of the neighborhood, made it 4 blocks before the light at Nolansville and Edmondson went red. And when I stopped, it came down on me, fully, completely, not a shred of buffer left. That storage shed. The one I'd stood 20 feet from on a March evening, hands shoved in my pockets, looking out at the backyard, while Derek asked whether I wanted coffee. The one with the new padlock and the reinforced door frame that my engineer's eye had clocked, and my father's heart had never followed up on. My daughter had been inside that shed, while I stood there looking at it and then walked back inside to finish dessert. I pulled the truck to the curb, cut the engine, pressed both hands over my face, and bore down until I could feel my pulse beating in my palms, and I stayed like that for a long time while traffic moved around me. The May afternoon kept right on being warm and ordinary and completely indifferent. When I finally reached for my phone, my hands were shaking so badly I had to dial Diane's number twice. She picked up on the first ring. "Walt." "What happened?" I told her. All of it. Yvette's voice, the scratching at the door, gapped the boy's face when he said the word. Help. The dog named Peanut, who had disappeared. I told her about the shed, what I had and hadn't done, when I'd stood 20 feet from it back in March. Diane didn't make a sound while I talked. When I finished the line, stayed quiet long enough that I pulled the phone away to check we were still connected. Then she spoke. Her voice was flat and clear, and absolutely certain the voice she used when a decision had already been reached, and all that remained was carrying it out. "Walt," she said, "we need Boyd and we need Clyde tonight." They arrived within 20 minutes of each other. Clyde came first. He pulled up in his sedan, came through the back door the way I'd told him to, and set his folder on the kitchen table without being asked. Boyd showed up 7 minutes later, still in his work clothes, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He shook Clyde's hand, then mine, and squeezed Diane's shoulder. Diane had made coffee. None of us touched it. The kitchen clock read 10:04. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels borrowed, like something holding its breath. "Walk me through everything," Boyd said. "In order, all of it." Clyde opened the folder. He was methodical the way good investigators are. No drama, no editorializing, just the facts arranged in the sequence they mattered. He started with the signatures, 2 sheets placed side by side on the table, the delivery receipt from February, the catering contract from the wedding. He walked Boyd through the directional differences, the letter formation, the pen pressure. Boyd leaned in close, put his reading glasses on, and studied them for a full 30 seconds without a word. Then Clyde moved to the financial records. Derek Colton's debt profile, $400,000 spread across 2 private lenders, a commercial credit line 17 months in default, 3 LLCs structured to obscure personal liability, assets transferred into Pamela Colton's name in 2020, before the debt had fully materialized. Fraudulent conveyance, Boyd said quietly, almost to himself. Moving assets out of reach of creditors. That's a separate charge if we get there. Clyde nodded. He pulled out the cosmetic surgery records, the Huntsville, Alabama clinic, the cash payments, the timeline. Then the phone record metadata from Derek's secondary number, a prepaid device registered to a shell address, showing steady contact with a number traced back to Lacey Pruitt, going back 18 months before the wedding. They were coordinating long before Derek ever approached Nora. Clyde said the surgery, the timing, the whole approach, all of it had been mapped out in advance. Boyd took his glasses off and set them on the table. He pressed 2 fingers to his mouth and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then, "What's the weakest point in the chain?" Tying Lacey's current identity to the surgery records, Clyde said, "The clinic used a patient alias. We have strong circumstantial alignment timing, payment method, physical description, but no signed document bearing her name. That's manageable if we have a live witness who can place her." Boyd looked at me. "Walt, you said there was something else." "The shed." I told him about the boy, about the scratching sound, the voice through the door gap, the face in the sliver of light. I kept it factual the way Clyde had modeled it, sequence then detail. No embellishment, because the facts were already terrible enough on their own. When I finished, Boyd and Clyde looked at each other across the table. It was the look of 2 men who had both sat in rooms where terrible things were confirmed, who knew precisely what this meant and who understood. The next words had to be chosen carefully, because Diane was sitting 2 feet away. "We cannot go in ourselves," Boyd said, his voice measured and absolute. "Any unauthorized entry contaminates the physical evidence and hands their defense attorneys a suppression argument that could bring down the entire case. Whatever is in that shed, we leave it untouched until law enforcement goes in with proper authority." Diane made a sound, small, involuntary, the sound of a mother physically holding herself in check. "I know," Boyd said to her gently, but without yielding an inch. "I know, but if we handle this wrong, the people who did this walk free. We handle it right, they don't." Clyde leaned forward. "We need someone official to move on this. A detective with no ties to Derek's network. Someone who will take it seriously and act fast." He looked at Boyd. "You said you knew someone." Boyd was already reaching for his phone. "Tamara Osei. She's been with Nashville PD for 18 years, the last 6 in criminal investigations. She's worked cases where people with money threw up roadblocks before. She doesn't get dazzled by contractors with smooth handshakes." He was already dialing. The call ran 11 minutes. Boyd did most of the talking, laying out the summary in the precise, structured way he'd built a career on facts, first inference, second request, last. We could hear Tamara's voice, though not her words. Her tone was sharp, and even the sound of someone already running 3 steps ahead. When Boyd hung up, he set the phone on the table and held his eyes on it a moment before looking at me. Then Clyde spoke again. "There's one more thing," he said. "I've been sitting on it because I needed to be certain." He pulled a second set of papers from the back of the folder. Pamela Colton. He laid out what he'd found piece by piece. Pamela's personal phone records showing contact with Derek's prepaid number and with Lacey Pruitt going back 2 years. A cash withdrawal from Pamela's personal account, $8,000 a single transaction 14 months ago. Matching in timing and amount with the final payment to the Huntsville, Alabama clinic. And hardware store receipts pulled from a loyalty card account Pamela had used without giving it a second thought. Heavy-duty padlocks, door reinforcement hardware, acoustic insulation, panels purchased 8 months ago. Delivered to an address 1 block from Derek and Nora's house, then redirected. She bought soundproofing materials, Diane said. Her voice was completely drained of inflection, which was more frightening than if she'd raised it. "Yes," Clyde said. The kitchen went very still. She didn't just help, Clyde said. She built this. Boyd put his glasses back on and started writing. Diane's hand found mine under the table. Her fingers were ice cold. She gripped so hard my knuckles pressed together, and I let her. I needed something to hold on to just as badly. Boyd looked up. "Tamara will meet us tomorrow morning at my office. 800. He held my gaze with the steady directness of a man who had spent 30 years delivering hard information to people who weren't ready for it. "Walt, if your daughter is in that shed, she's been there for months. We don't know what condition she's in. You need to prepare yourself for that." The words moved through me the way a structural failure does. That low, deep groan a load-bearing wall makes just before everything shifts. Diane's grip on my hand tightened until it hurt. I held on. Tamara Osei arrived at Boyd's office at 7:58, 2 minutes early, which told me something about her before she opened her mouth. She was mid-40s, medium height, natural hair pulled back with no fuss. Dark blazer over a gray shirt, detective's shield clipped to her belt. Her handshake was firm and fast. The handshake of someone who'd figured out that women in her position had to prove competence in the first 10 seconds or spend the rest of the conversation fighting for it. She settled across from us, flipped open a fresh notepad, uncapped her pen, and said, "From the beginning, don't summarize. I want the details." So I gave her the details. She didn't interrupt once. She wrote without stopping her pen, moving in tight, economical strokes across the page. When I brought up the signatures, she asked to see the originals. When I mentioned the surgery timeline, she asked for Clyde's documentation. When I described what Derek had seen and heard her pen slowed slightly, not out of doubt, I understood, but from the deliberateness of someone making sure they got it right. When I was done, she sat quietly reviewing her notes for 2 full minutes. Then she looked up. "The physical evidence is solid," she said. "The signatures, the financial records, the surgery timeline, that's a coherent chain. What's missing is live witness testimony placing a specific individual at the shed." She paused. "You said there's a 10-year-old boy and his mother who saw the face." "Yes," I said. "I need to speak with both of them directly." She glanced at Boyd. "And I'll need to approach the boy separately from his mother. Standard protocol with minor witnesses keeps the testimony clean, shuts down any later claim that the child was coached." Boyd nodded. We drove to Yvette's house in 2 cars. Tamara had asked to ride separately, which I understood she needed to arrive as law enforcement, not as an extension of our group. Yvette opened the door before Tamara even knocked. She'd watched us pull up. She looked at Tamara's shield, then at her face, and something in the way she was holding herself shifted. Not relaxing exactly, more like recalibrating. "Mrs. Webb," Tamara said, "I'm Detective Tamara Osei, Nashville Davidson PD. I'd like to speak with you about what you witnessed next door. You're under no obligation to talk to me, and you're welcome to have an attorney here if you choose. But I'm asking because what you know may help us reach someone who needs it." Yvette held the door open. "Come in." Diane and I waited in the living room, while Tamara sat at the kitchen table with Yvette. I could hear Yvette's voice low at first, then steadier, gaining ground as she went. The same account she'd given me, but fuller, details she'd held back before because she hadn't been certain anyone would be able to use them. The night she'd watched Pamela drag Nora across the back porch by the arm. The morning she'd found a broken plate in the yard that had come over the fence. The 3 months of abrupt silence that had felt wrong from the very first day. Then Tamara asked Derek to come in on his own. Yvette looked at her son. He looked back at her with those calm, steady 10-year-old eyes and said, "It's okay, Mom," in a tone that made Yvette press her hand over her mouth for just a moment. She nodded. He went in. I sat with Yvette in the living room. She stared at the closed kitchen door, fingers working the hem of her scrub top. "He shouldn't have to do this," she said. Her voice broke cleanly on the last word, snapping right through the middle of it, like something dry giving way. "He's 10 years old. He was just raking up leaves. He's the bravest person in this whole thing," I said, and I meant every word. 15 minutes later, Tamara came out of the kitchen. Derek followed, settled in beside his mother, and leaned his full weight into her side. The weight of a child who has done something meant for adults and is ready to be small again. Yvette pulled him in without looking down, arm wrapping around him on instinct. Tamara stood in the doorway and looked at Yvette. "Mrs. Webb, I want to answer your question directly. You asked who protects you and your son if this goes wrong." Yvette looked up. "I do," Tamara said. "That's not a promise I make lightly, but I make it." She held Yvette's gaze for a beat. "I'll have the warrant by tomorrow morning." After she left, after the door shut and the sound of her car faded down the street, Yvette looked at me. The television was off. Derek had fallen asleep against her shoulder, his breathing slow and even his face finely loose the way a child's face goes when they stop carrying something. "I heard her crying at night," Yvette said quietly. "More than once. I told myself it wasn't my place." Her jaw went tight. "I'm sorry I waited as long as I did. I looked at this woman working nights to keep the lights on, raising her son by herself, carrying this for months because she hadn't believed anyone would listen." "You're here now," I said. She gave one small nod and pulled Derek a little closer. I drove home through the May evening, with the windows down, the warm air moving through the cab of the truck, and I tried to think in practical terms about tomorrow and couldn't hold any practical thought for more than a few seconds. At home, Diane was already in bed. I went to the kitchen, opened the cabinet above the refrigerator, and lifted down the wooden box. I carried it to the table and sat under the single overhead light and opened the latch. 28 cards. I went through them one by one. The orange cat, the bicycle, the guitar, all those years of Nora and pencil and crayon and ballpoint pen. When I reached the last one, the 28th, I held it in both hands and looked at the two hands I'd drawn reaching toward each other from opposite edges of the card. Then I closed the box, returned it to the cabinet, switched off the kitchen light, and went upstairs. Tomorrow, we would go get our daughter. I could hear Yvette's voice low at first, then steadier, gaining confidence as she went. The same story she'd shared with me, but more complete now. Details she'd held back because she hadn't been certain I could do anything useful with them. The night she'd watched Pamela drag Nora across the back porch by the arm. The morning she'd found a broken plate lying in the yard thrown over the fence. The 3 months of abrupt silence that had felt wrong from the very first day. Then Tamara asked the boy to come in by himself. Yvette looked at her son. He looked back at her with those calm, steady 10-year-old eyes and said, "It's okay, Mom," in a tone that made Yvette press her hand over her mouth just for a moment. She nodded. He went in. I sat with Yvette in the living room. She stared at the closed kitchen door, fingers working at the hem of her scrub top. "He shouldn't have to do this," she said. Her voice broke cleanly on that last word, snapped right through the middle of it, the way something dry gives when you bend it too far. "He's 10 years old. He was out there raking leaves. He's the bravest person in this whole thing." I said it and meant every word. 15 minutes later, Tamara came back out of the kitchen. The boy followed, settled in beside his mother, and leaned his full weight into her side. The weight of a child who has just done something adult and is ready to stop. Yvette put her arm around him, without looking down, just drew him close. Tamara stood in the doorway and looked at Yvette. "Mrs. Webb, I want to answer your question directly. You asked, who protects you and your son if this goes wrong?" Yvette looked up. "I do," Tamara said. "That's not a promise I make easily, but I'm making it." She held Yvette's gaze for a long moment. "I'll have the warrant by tomorrow morning." After she left, after the door had closed and the sound of her car faded down the street, Yvette looked over at me. The television was off. Her son had fallen asleep against her shoulder, his breathing slow, and even his face finely loose the way a child's face goes when they've stopped working at something. I heard her crying at night, Yvette said quietly, more than once. I told myself it wasn't my place. Her jaw tightened. I'm sorry I waited so long. I looked at this woman pulling night shifts to keep the lights on, raising her son alone, carrying this for months, because she hadn't believed anyone would listen. You're here now, I said. She nodded once and drew him a little closer. I drove home through the May evening with the windows down and the warm air moving through the truck, and I tried to think in practical terms about what tomorrow would bring, and couldn't hold on to any of it for more than a few seconds. At home, Diane was already in bed. I went to the kitchen, opened the cabinet above the refrigerator, and lifted down the wooden box. I brought it to the kitchen table and sat beneath the single overhead light and released the latch. 28 cards. I went through them one by one. The orange cat, the bicycle, the guitar, all those years of Nora in pencil and crayon and ballpoint pen. When I reached the last one, the 28th, I held it in both hands and looked at the two hands I'd drawn reaching toward each other from opposite sides of the paper. Then I closed the box, returned it to the cabinet, turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs. Tomorrow, we would go get our daughter. The flashlight cut a pale cone across the far left corner of the shed, and in that light, I saw her. She was on the floor back against the wall, knees drawn up. She was wearing what had once been a blouse, now gray and shapeless, layered over two other shirts visible at the collar. Her hair was matted gone, the dull color it gets when it hasn't been properly washed in months. Her face, her real face, her actual face, the one I had known for 28 years, was sharpened by the particular gauntness of someone given just enough to survive, and nothing beyond that. Her cheekbones pressed outward against the skin. Her wrists, where her sleeves had ridden up, were thin as a child's. Peanut lay pressed against her hip head, up now ears forward, making a sound that was neither bark nor whimper. The sound of a small animal running entirely on protective instinct, with almost no body left to sustain it. Nora looked up. She looked at me the way you look at something you've trained yourself to stop expecting, cautious, suspended. Like someone braced for the moment, it turns out to be wrong again. Her eyes moved across my face, slowly checking each feature. I watched her do it, and my throat closed so completely I couldn't have made a sound if I'd tried. I crossed the floor and went down on both knees in front of her, the cold concrete beneath me not registering at all. Nora, I said. My voice came out wrecked. It's Dad, I'm here. Something shifted in her face. The suspension broke. Her chin dropped and her shoulders began to shake. And the sound she made wasn't exactly a cry. It was the sound of something that has been held rigid for so long that the release itself feels like a violence. Her hands were in her lap. As I watched, the right one opened, fingers uncurling slowly, and there in her palm, crumpled and stained the yellow of old paper. The creases worn soft from constant handling, was a small folded square I recognized before I could read it. I had written it in my own hand with a Sharpie on a piece of notepaper from the kitchen drawer the night before her wedding. I had slipped it into the interior pocket of her dress bag while she was in the shower, meaning for her to find it later, or not at all, whichever she needed. Dad's always here. She had kept it for 19 weeks in a locked shed with no heat and one meal a day when he remembered. She had kept it tucked inside the lining of her shirt against her skin, where no one thought to look. My shoulders were shaking before I even knew it was happening. I pressed both hands over my eyes and bent forward, and my whole chest heaved with something that had been building since October and had nowhere left to go. Then her hand came up, bones visible beneath the skin, fingernails broken to the quick from 19 weeks of scratching tallies into wood, and she set it on my shoulder, light as paper. I knew you'd come, she whispered. Her voice was destroyed, cracked and rough. A voice that had gone unused for months, except a call for help that never arrived. I kept counting. I knew you were counting too. I put my arms around her very carefully, the way you hold something that might not survive a wrong move. And she leaned into me, and I felt how little of her remained, and my chest cracked open the rest of the way. Peanut got to his feet, his legs unsteady, trembling beneath a body that had given most of itself away. He pressed his small head against my knee and left it there. I don't know how long we stayed like that. At some point, I became aware of Diane in the doorway. She hadn't made a sound coming in. She stood just inside the threshold, one hand pressed flat against the doorframe to hold herself upright, and she looked at her daughter on the floor of that shed, and her face did something I had never seen it do in 40 years of marriage. It gave way entirely, every muscle releasing at once grief and relief, arriving in the same instant, colliding and undoing each other on impact. "Mom!" Nora's voice broke on that single syllable. Diane crossed the floor in 4 steps and went down beside us. She gathered Nora's face in both hands the way she had when Nora was small and feverish and needed to be seen. And she said, "I've got you, I've got you, I've got you," repeating it like something that had to be said 3 times before it would hold. Nora told us things in pieces while we waited, fractured out of order, the way memories surface when the dam finally gives. 19 weeks. She knew because she'd scratched a mark into the wood panel beside the door each morning, when the light changed 1 mark per day, 7 marks to a group, the way prisoners have always counted. When they found her, there were 19 complete groups and 4 additional marks. 137 days. Derek brought food once a day, whatever was left from dinner, sometimes nothing at all. There were nights Peanut pushed his bowl toward her. She said it quickly, the way you state a fact you've already made your peace with, and I had to turn and look at the shed wall to keep my face together. Winter had been the hardest. No heat, only whatever she could layer from the drop cloths and old rags piled in the corner. Pamela came once a week and talked through the door like a neighbor chatting over a fence. She was never angry, that's what Nora told me. That's the thing I kept returning to. I pictured Pamela standing in that doorway earlier, those eyes like still water looking across the yard at me. The absolute steadiness with which she'd ordered Derek to keep his mouth shut. The note Nora described, finding it wedged in her dress bag that first morning, buried in the interior pocket. She'd only gone looking because the cold had driven her to pull on another layer. She worked it open in the darkness, couldn't decipher the words, so she held it close until a sliver of light leaked through the gap in the door and made the letters readable. From then on, she kept it tucked in her bra lining. Each night she'd draw it out and hold it in her hand. Not for any promise it made, but because it told her something true, that she had mattered to another person, before any of this swallowed her whole. That a version of her had existed prior to that shed. That somebody had cared enough to press 4 words onto paper and conceal them in a place she'd eventually reach. The ambulance arrived out front. We caught the sound of it, doors swinging, radio crackling, voices clipped and efficient. 2 paramedics entered through the back with a stretcher. Nora studied them, then looked at me, the way a person looks when survival has trained them out of trust and they're being asked to try it one more time. "I've got you," I told her. "We're right here." She let them take her weight. Peanut moved to follow, and one of the paramedics without hesitation bent and gathered him up and settled him under his arm. Nora watched that happen, and something across her face eased the first time I'd seen it. We went through the house, back door, kitchen, out to the front. Derek was on the lawn, wrists zip-tied behind him, a uniformed officer planted at his side. Pamela was positioned near the cruiser, standing perfectly straight, robe pulled tight around her like something fortified, watching us come with those same still eyes. Lacey sat hunched on the front steps, face angled down at the concrete. She didn't raise her head as we went by. Derek's gaze found the stretcher, found Nora lying on it. Something crossed his face. Not remorse, nothing with that kind of texture. More like a man recalculating, already rearranging his next line of defense. He met my eyes, and I held them for 2 full seconds, enough to confirm there was nothing in that look worth anything to me. I turned back to my daughter, covered her hand with mine, and walked beside her all the way to the ambulance. The chair outside Nora's room was built to punish anyone who stayed too long, rigid, a ½ inch too narrow, the armrest positioned at precisely the angle that achieves nothing. I'd been wedged into it for 40 minutes. I felt all 40 in my spine. I didn't shift. Diane sat next to me, fingers laced together in her lap, gaze locked on the closed door. The hallway carried that hospital smell, antiseptic layered over the stale, recycled air that belongs to every building where someone is being sustained by machines instead of will. A cart rolled by somewhere down the corridor. A phone rang at the nursing desk. The entirely ordinary sounds of a morning that had no awareness of what was unfolding behind that door. The wall clock showed 9:17 when Tamara Osei came around the corner. She moved the way she always did. No hurry, no wasted motion, carrying herself with the kind of quiet authority that doesn't announce itself. She dragged a chair over and sat facing us, skipping any greeting. "Derek and Pamela are in custody," she said. "Processing is in progress." Pamela asked for a lawyer the moment they brought her in. Didn't say a single word before counsel arrived. Nothing, not even a look. A pause. Derek did the same. Both of them straight down the line. Diane's jaw went tight, and Lacey Ozzy's face changed. Not surprise exactly, not satisfaction either. A different thing altogether. She sat at the table in the interview room, laid her hands flat and said, "I knew you'd come. I just didn't know it was today." Tamara looked at me. "She's already requested a conversation with the DA's office. She wants a deal. She'll receive a reduced sentence in exchange for her cooperation," I said. No bitterness in it, I was just turning the fact over, getting a feel for its edges. "Almost certainly," Tamara said. "But the value of what she hands over outweighs whatever she takes in return. Her account supports the physical evidence and maps out how the conspiracy unfolded. Derek's legal team won't be able to dismantle that." My phone buzzed. Boyd. I moved down the hall and picked up. He laid out the charges in that careful, methodical way he had: unlawful imprisonment, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, obtaining property by deception. Pamela was looking at all of those, plus an additional count of aiding and abetting, and depending on what Lacey's cooperation yielded, potentially further charges connected to the advanced planning. The soundproofing materials, Boyd said, Pamela buying those carries real weight. It speaks to premeditation. It puts her inside the confinement itself, not just orbiting the financial piece. Judges pay attention to that kind of distinction. "And the money?" I asked. A beat of silence. Clyde has been going through the accounts. Derek had been moving funds hard over the last several months. Offshore arrangements, stacked transfers designed to obscure the trail. Civil recovery through the fraud charges is the avenue. But I want to level with you, Walt. Best case is partial. You won't see all of it back. I stood there in that corridor, and my mind went to 15 years of $20 bills folded into a kitchen drawer, to the check I'd signed myself at the closing table, pen in my own hand. "Okay," I said. "I'm sorry," Boyd said. "That isn't easy news. It's not the thing I'm focused on right now," I said. "I meant that." I went back and took my seat beside Diane. Tamara hadn't left. She had her notepad open, eyes moving over whatever was written there. "There's one more thing," she said, still not looking up. "When they brought Pamela out to the cruiser this morning, she stopped mid-stride, turned and looked back at the house. I assumed she was about to speak. Ask about Derek maybe. Ask about Lacey. Something with a pulse." Tamara put the pen down. Her eyes went to the shed. Just the shed. She held it for about 4 seconds. Then she got in the car without a word. The hallway seemed to drop a degree. Diane asked quietly, "What does that mean?" "It means," Tamara said, "that for Pamela Colton, what took place in that shed was not something she'd done reluctantly. It wasn't a necessary ugliness. It was something she had constructed, something that was," she seemed to weigh the word before she used it, "satisfying to her. Neither of us said anything. There's no answer for something like that." Tamara got to her feet and put the notepad away. One more detail from Lacey's initial statement. Pamela ran the logistics side. Lacey wasn't brought in on the soundproofing or the alterations made to the shed's interior, and Lacey told them she had no idea Pamela had been going back there visiting your daughter on a weekly basis. She went to see Nora. Diane said it in a voice that had gone hollow and flat, the voice of someone who has already absorbed all the horror they can hold. Once every week, by Lacey's account. When Lacey learned that this morning, sitting in the interview room, she went completely silent for close to 2 minutes. Tamara held my gaze. Then she said, "I thought we were just taking money. I didn't know she was enjoying it." What moved through me in that moment had no name I could reach for. Not anger I'd gone past where anger can exist, into something deeper and colder, something that doesn't fade the way anger does. The realization that Pamela Colton hadn't simply signed on to someone else's scheme. She had built it herself, and somewhere in the doing of it, she had found something that fed her. Tamara left. Diane and I remained there with it. At 9:51, the door to Nora's room swung open. A doctor in green scrubs stepped into the hallway, pulling her mask down. Younger than Nora was my first thought, and wearing the measured expression of someone who knows that how they say a thing is nearly as important as the thing itself. I was standing before she got a word out. "She's stable," the doctor told us. "Malnourished and dehydrated electrolytes significantly off. We're working on correcting that. We'd like to keep her for monitoring and nutritional support over the next several days." A pause. "But she's alert-oriented vitals moving in the right direction." Then a smaller pause. "She's asking for you?" Diane made a sound, the kind that comes when relief gives way all at once, unguarded, complete, like lungs finally emptying. Both hands went to her mouth. I gave the doctor a nod, pressed the door open, and went in. By the time afternoon arrived, the light coming through the hospital window had shifted gold and low, that particular slant of a May evening in Tennessee, the light that settles over everything, like it's granting some kind of temporary pardon. Nora had the bed raised so she was propped partway up. An IV line fed into her left arm fluid running clear and steady. Peanut Diane had made the request, someone had made a call, and a vet from a clinic 2 blocks away had driven over and gone through him and reported him severely underweight. But sound otherwise was curled at the foot of her bed, in the position he'd always chosen, nose buried beneath his tail. Diane stood near the window, arms loosely crossed, not speaking, just present, which was what Nora needed more than any words right then. I sat in the chair beside the bed, with my hand resting over hers. Her fingers were cold, the nails were bitten down to nothing, several torn rather than cut, and I understood what that told me, and I kept my eyes away from the walls of that shed in my head. She spoke in the unhurried, almost removed way of someone recounting a story they've replayed so many times, it's worn smooth. Not because the pain had left. I could see it working on her, the way her jaw clenched around certain words, the way she'd stop mid-sentence and begin again. But she had lived inside this story for 19 weeks. She knew every corner of it. The first night she said she came to, in complete darkness, her head splitting her mouth, carrying a chemical taste she couldn't name. She had no idea where she was. She called Peanut's name because it was the first thing her mind reached for. He came to her out of the dark, and she grabbed him and didn't let go. That was the first thing she could be sure of after waking. He was there. She was not completely alone. He never used my name. She said, "Derek, not once in 137 days. It was always you or nothing." Her voice didn't waver. I think that was deliberate. When you stop saying someone's name, you stop seeing them as a person. It's easier, she said. Derek had initially talked about getting rid of Peanut. Pamela told him no. A dog scratching at a fence or barking for its owner draws attention. One that simply vanishes inside a shed does not. It was the most useful thing Pamela ever did for either of them. I pressed my hand down harder over hers. She let me. Pamela came every week. Every Thursday I flinched when she said Thursday, and she noticed. "I know," she said quietly. I counted those too. Pamela would drag a folding chair from somewhere and sit on the other side of the shed door and speak through the wood as casually as a neighbor chatting over a fence. She told Nora that Walt and Diane had moved on, that they'd accepted her absence, that they were honestly relieved not to worry anymore, that the money was being put to good use, that some people simply weren't made for the lives they'd been born into, and that Nora should try to understand this was a correction, not a cruelty. She believed it. Nora said that's the part I kept returning to in the dark. She wasn't trying to hurt me. She genuinely thought she was explaining something real. She looked at the IV line. That frightened me more than Derek ever did. When Nora mentioned the nights Peanut pushed his food bowl toward her, I looked away toward the window. The gold light sat there indifferent and beautiful. I heard Diane shift behind me and knew without turning that she'd face the glass. The note Nora said she found it that first morning, shaking with cold, going through everything in the shed, hunting for something to put on. It was tucked in the pocket of her dress bag, the bag they'd tossed in with her, probably without even glancing at it. She unfolded it in the dark and couldn't make out a word. She held it until the thin line of light beneath the door grew bright enough to read by. "I read it every night after that," she said. "Not because I was sure you'd come." She looked at me directly, and her eyes held the clarity that settles in after everything has already been cried out. But to remember who I was before all of this, there was a version of me that someone thought was worth 4 words on a piece of paper. I needed to hold on to that. I couldn't speak for a moment. I looked at our hands resting on the blanket, her thin, torn fingers beneath my old ones. "Dad," her voice changed register. "Did you draw my card this year?" I understood at once. Her 29th birthday had come and gone while she was in that shed. I hadn't known it was passing. I hadn't drawn a thing. "Not yet," I said. She nodded once, and the corners of her mouth moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile, but held the shape one would take if it came. "Okay," she said. That one word. The weight of it was vast and tender, at the same time forgiveness offered without being asked for, which is the only kind that carries any meaning. She turned toward the window. The light was fading now, the gold shifting toward Rose. "What happens to them?" she asked. I told her Boyd was working it. Lacey had already given a statement, and the charges were serious, and the evidence was strong. She listened. Then, "I don't need to see them punished, Dad. I just need to know they can't do this to anyone else." I looked at my daughter, Not the girl from the house warming spinning through the rooms with that enormous laugh. Not the woman I'd feared I'd lost for good. Someone between those two, finding the path that joined them, walking it one careful step at a time. Peanut lifted his head from the foot of the bed, looked at Nora, then set it back down. Outside, the Tennessee evening settled in. 18 months is a long time. Long enough for the azaleas to come back twice for the tomatoes I planted along the south fence to produce 2 full seasons for the wood on the back porch steps to need replacing. Long enough for a great many things to change shape. I'm sitting on the porch now, coffee going cold in my hand, looking out at the garden and thinking about how to say what came after. Derek Colton accepted a plea agreement in October 2023. 12 years no early release consideration for the first 8. Pamela Colton went to trial and was convicted on all counts: unlawful imprisonment, conspiracy, aiding, and abetting, and received 8 years. The judge noting at sentencing that the evidence of premeditation and active participation made leniency inappropriate. Pamela received the sentence without visible reaction. The court reporter noted she did not speak, did not flinch, and did not look at Nora, who sat in the third row with Diane's hand in hers. Lacey Pruitt cooperated fully. Probation, restitution, and 5 years of supervised release. Whether that was just is not something I've spent much energy deciding. What she gave the prosecution made the case airtight. That's what I know. The money, most of it is gone. Boyd recovered a portion through civil litigation against Derek's remaining domestic assets. Enough to matter, not enough to replace 15 years of careful saving. I've made peace with that, the way you make peace with something that cost you more than it should have and cannot be undone. You just stop doing the math. Nora came home from the hospital after 3 weeks. She moved back into her old room. Diane had never touched it. And I understood then that this wasn't sentiment, it was foresight. The particular knowing of a mother who'd kept a door open because some part of her had always believed it might need to be walked back through. The first weeks were quiet. Nora slept a great deal, the deep spent sleep of a body rebuilding itself from the inside out. She would sit in the window seat in her room for long stretches, not reading, not reaching for her phone, just watching the backyard. Peanut stationed himself directly on top of her feet, wherever she settled, as though his assignment was to make certain she didn't disappear again. And maybe it was. Diane didn't push. She really cooked the full Sunday dinners and the weeknight soups and the homemade apple cake that had gone untouched at the housewarming. She left doors open. She sat near Nora without requiring anything, just present the way good teachers learn to be filling the room without demanding to be noticed. Somewhere in the second month, Nora started talking more. Not about what happened that came slowly in pieces, mostly to a therapist she saw twice a week in a small office on Granny White Pike, but other things. Opinions about shows she was watching, memories that floated up and wanted to be spoken aloud. The evening she told us about a disastrous group project from her sophomore year at Vanderbilt University, and laughed. Really laughed, the big unguarded laugh she got from Diane. I had to get up and refill my water glass and stand in the kitchen alone for a minute. Her 29th birthday fell on a Thursday in July. I gave her the card after dinner. I'd worked on it for 3 evenings. Not the cat, not the guitar, not any of the particular things from particular years. Just a door drawn in pencil plane and simple, slightly ajar with light coming through from the other side. Nothing written inside. I hadn't known what to put down, and I decided that was all right. The drawing was enough. Nora held it in both hands for a long moment. She studied it the way she used to study a problem she was turning over in her mind, steady, unhurried, giving it the weight it deserved. Then she looked up at me. Her eyes were bright, but she didn't cry. One nod. That was enough for both of us. In August, we brought food over to Yvette Webb's house. Diane's homemade apple cake, a pot of chili, the kind of thank you that doesn't embarrass itself by trying to be proportional to what it's standing in for. Marcus Webb came to the door and looked past us right away, searching. "Did you bring Peanut?" he asked. Nora stepped out from behind me with Peanut on his leash, fully himself. Now solid and bright-eyed, the dog equivalent of someone who has eaten well for 6 months and fully intends to keep doing so. Marcus Webb dropped straight to the porch floor, and Peanut climbed into his lap, and they carried on their reunion at considerable volume while the adults attempted a conversation over the top of it. Yvette looked at Nora across the porch. A long, careful look, the look of someone checking on something they'd been quietly worried about for a long time. Then she looked at me. "How is she?" She said it softly, Really, she's finding her way back, I said. Some days faster than others. Yvette nodded. She understood exactly what that meant. She'd been finding her own way back from something for a while now. Nora moved into her own apartment in January 2024. Small place, second floor, good light through the east windows. She's working again, design projects, the kind that let her set her own hours while she rebuilds the stamina for more. She hasn't painted much, but 3 weeks ago she sent me a photo of a canvas she'd been working on. Unfinished colors, still rough, the composition not fully settled. She didn't say a word about it in the message, just sent the image. I looked at it for a long time. Then I wrote back, I like it. She replied with a single thumbs up and nothing more, which is exactly what Nora would do. And it was the best thing I'd read in months. I tell this story, not because I want anything from the people who hear it. I tell it because I am a father who stood 20 FT from a locked shed and walked away, and I will carry that for the rest of my life. But I am also a father who knelt on a cold concrete floor and watched his daughter open her hand and found in her palm a piece of paper he had written and long since forgotten that she had held onto for 137 days because it reminded her who she was. 5 things I know now that I didn't know then. Love is not enough without attention. I loved my daughter completely. I missed what was being done to her for months because I reached for the explanations that let me sleep at night. Children see what adults choose not to. A 10-year-old boy stopped me in a driveway and told me the truth. I nearly didn't listen. People don't come forward because they don't believe anyone will take them seriously. Yvette Webb heard everything. What she needed wasn't courage. She already had that. What she needed was someone willing to stand on her porch and say, I believe you. The most dangerous people are not the ones who lose control. They are the ones who never do. And the last one. My daughter kept a folded piece of paper close to her for 19 weeks. Not because she was certain I was coming, because it told her who she was before any of this started. Sometimes that's all it takes. Something small to remind you that you're still here. Walt found his daughter in a locked shed after 137 days. Nora was still holding the note he'd slipped into her bag the night before the wedding. 4 words. That's what she had held on to. I've thought about this story a great deal since I first heard it. What it cost that family, the years, the trust, the money that can never fully be replaced, sits heavy. But I believe God puts the right people in the right place at the right moment, even when we can't see the shape of it yet. A 10-year-old boy stood at the bottom of a driveway and said what the adults around him were afraid to say out loud. That was the hinge point. Everything turned on it. If you love someone, pay attention not just to what they say, but to what changes. Love without attention has gaps that the wrong people learn to walk through. Never dismiss a child who tells you something feels wrong. They haven't yet learned to talk themselves out of what they can plainly see. When someone asks you to believe them and it costs you nothing to listen, listen. That willingness can be the difference between a life saved and a life lost. And hold on to the small things you do for the people you love. You may never know which one they carry with them through the dark. These are the kinds of father stories and grandpa revenge stories that remind me why it matters to keep showing up. Even when you've made mistakes, even when you walked away from the shed too soon, you turn around, you go back. That's the whole of it. If this story moved, you share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a thought in the comments I read, everyone. And if you haven't yet subscribed to Grandpa's Revenge so you don't miss what comes next, thank you for being here. Take good care of yourselves, and I'll talk to you soon.